here we are again. So we're looking at section 7. Man, the image of God. Oh, look at that. One of my favorite things to talk about.
What page?
Page 195. This title of this chapter is Evolution and Origins. One of my favorite speakers right now is Jordan Peterson. I really enjoy listening to him, but he can't get over the evolutionary psychology that he's studied for so long. He's completely convinced that this is the way things came into being, which is really something because he likes to talk about the Bible a lot. And he has made a declaration that the Bible is truth. Truth, as in contains truth. But I wish that people would believe the Bible is true. Because I heard a really fascinating discussion this morning between Dr. Johnson and another doctor of linguistics. And they were talking about linguistics being, among other things, the study of how language develops, why human beings are the only animal on the earth that speaks language. And that regardless of the different languages, the mechanisms for learning language and speaking language are the same in people around the world. And how interesting that is that there must be some genetic code that developed millions of years ago that caused us to be able to develop speech. And I'm listening to this conversation and the mysteries of it, thinking, the reason that we speak and none of the animals speak is because we're not animals. We are mankind made in the image of God, who is able to communicate even in himself, amongst the triunity of himself. Let us make man in our own image. There is an element of language and communication that exists in God that he put in us. And I don't see, possibly no subject is more widely debated in various forms today than the question of how man originated. The night I wrote these words, our local TV news gave several minutes coverage to two creationists who were seeking to show that the discovery of some human bones made naturalistic evolution impossible. Court cases concerning the teaching of scientific creationism in the public schools have given nationwide publicity to the subject. The debate over inerrancy has rightly included discussion concerning the historicity of the Genesis account of creation. A number of views vie for acceptance even among evangelicals. So evolution simply means change in any direction. There is, of course, a completely legitimate use of the word, as, for example, in the sentence, there has been considerable evolution in the field of communications in this century. But when the word evolution is used in relation to origins, it means much more than change or development. It includes the idea of origin by natural processes both the origin of the first living substance and the origin of new species. It theorizes that several billion years ago, chemicals in the sea, acted on by sunlight and cosmic energy, formed themselves to change into one or more single-celled organisms, which have since developed through beneficial mutations and natural selection into all living plants, animals, and people. That is a good description of the Darwinistic theory of evolution. And here's what I have to declare: that it requires belief. You have to exercise faith to believe that that is true, because there is no scientific method involved in it. Now, there are scientific experiments that are going on, and there are scientific explorations that are going on, which those who have this as their preconceived idea superimpose upon those scientific evidences. So the empirical evidence in the world is the same whether you're a scientist or a creationist. The empirical evidence, the scientific realities as we know them, are the same, but they are seen very differently by a creationist opposed to a evolutionist. My point being this, that both are ideologies that are accepted by faith and are therefore both religious ideas. And when you talk to a Darwinist, which is basically everyone you're going to meet, we don't want to attack the Darwinist. We want to instead strike out at the ism and bring to understanding the Darwinist that if they want to lay hold of Darwinism as being the truth, that's their choice, but understand that it's a religious choice. See, this is where the real difficulty lies, and that is that we've been taught Darwinism for so long that we being our culture has accepted Darwinism as being scientific fact. And so believing therefore that it's scientific fact causes people not to understand the degree of faith required to believe in Darwinism. So Darwinism masks as a scientific discovery when in fact it's not at all. It's not at all. It's a philosophical and religious point of view. So scientific method is that something can be observable, provable, repeatable. So if that's very, very brief, of course, of scientific method. But if you can demonstrate it and repeat that demonstration and get the same result again and again, then you can say, well, this is a scientific truth then. If, for instance, if you put an ice cube on the countertop and it's above 32 degrees in the room, that ice cube will turn from ice to water every time. Observable, provable, repeatable. That's very, very, very brief and not a complete description of the scientific method, of course, but Has anyone observed millions of years ago? Has any person observed what happened? Has anyone observed anything that has happened even 1 million years ago? Well, God observed it. He's the only one that was around. So, observable, Darwinism, observable, no. Well, what about the evidences of Darwinism? Observable only by manipulation. Only by manipulation are they observable, because you have to come to the observations, the empirical evidence, with a preconceived notion that you apply to that evidence in order to make evolution observable. In fact, the difficulty that Darwinism has is that they can't find a single transitional evidence from one species to the next. They can't find it. They can.
Should be something, if it was true, that should be changing.
Right. So they can draw it. They can draw pictures of it in the biology book. See, it's in the biology book. It shouldn't be in the biology book because it's not really science. It's not really biology. It's conjecture. Well, at any rate, why is it a soapbox for me? Because the majority of Christians that I meet have not completely abandoned Darwinism. Some haven't abandoned it at all, and there are various attempts to reconcile creation and Darwinism. Others have abandoned the idea that we have any relationship to monkeys. But here's the kicker. Even Christians that I meet who are completely convinced that we did not have a common ancestor with monkeys will still say that the earth is millions of years old.
We're fed that every day.
We're fed that every day. Yes, we are. So here's the thing, though. If you don't have a process of evolution, you don't have any requirement for the earth to be billions of years old. It only needs to be billions of years old if you want to lose the evidence in the annals of time. All right? So, as I say that, how many of you, of course, you've been somewhat taught by my constant bantering on this subject, but how many of you are a little bit like, well, but rocks are old. The earth is old. I mean, we might not have, humanity may have only been here, we count the generations back to Adam, but what about before that? What about before that? God called it into existence. Here's the thing about creation that will help you. We cannot prove creation. Darwinism cannot prove evolution. They're both belief systems. But wouldn't it and isn't it easier to believe that God called into existence what we see with order and design rather than chance and happenstance bringing everything into existence? Everything we see, everything that we observe are in systems. They have order to them. Everything, the stars in the sky have an order. They have a system. Everything is in. Even the fact that the curse disrupted the perfection of God's creation, nevertheless we see the order and design in the creation. It makes more sense to believe that there was a designer than to believe that it all happened by chance. All right? So, then the Creator did not create Adam and Eve as babies. They were created as adults. And so, why is it hard to believe that the Creator couldn't have created a mature universe? People are like, well, that star is a million light years away, and if the universe is only 10,000 years old, how did that light have time to get here? It's like, well, God created the earth and the star and everything in between. Created all of it. Created a mature universe. I don't understand why that is harder to believe than, I mean, let's roll evolution back to its beginning, the Big Bang Theory. You know what the Big Bang Theory? That before anything was, there was nothing. And that nothing became so concentrated that it exploded into everything.
That's not right.
Well, I mean, that's a very simplistic explanation of it, but that really is what the Big Bang Theory is. That nothing became so concentrated, it exploded and became everything over billions of years.
Well, do you think it was quiet when God said, "Let there be light"?
Do I think it was quiet?
Yeah. I think it was quite a racket.
I think there was an explosion of light.
Oh man. And I can't imagine it being quiet.
So that was a Big Bang, all right.
I'm sure there was.
Is that what he was getting at?
Take a look at the universes that we can just see in our galaxy alone, and then they go out beyond that and see. I mean, it couldn't have been quiet to make it.
Yeah.
The average guy would have wanted earplugs, I'm sure.
Yeah.
And it's,
But you think about this. It's the old, if a tree falls in the woods, does it make any noise if there's no one there to hear it?
yeah, there you go. It's that circular argument.
Right. So God created, and it could have very well been a Big Bang,
Very, very possible.
right? But that's very different than saying nothingness became so concentrated that it exploded.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, I think the flood compressed the plant life, and that's where our oil comes from.
Maybe. I don't think that oil comes from, and I think that decomposing things can become oil, but I don't think it's the only thing that oil comes from, because if you think about it, everything on the surface of the earth being like the hair on a dog, all right? And you take all the hair on a dog, it's not very much compared to the rest of him. So I'm like, okay, how could there be enough plant and animal remains to produce the amount of oil that we've already used? Even if it was a flood, or even if it was millions of years. How could that be? There's not that much. In fact, the life on the surface of the earth would be more like a dog with very little hair, if you think about it.
Because are you looking at it as a land mass versus the water mass?
Everything. All of the life that's on the earth, if you collected it into one big ball, would not be very significant compared to the size of the earth. So over how much time, like if the oil, it comes from vegetative and animal life that has died, how would it be laid down? Like, even as a kid, I was thinking of that, because that's what we've always been told, that oil is the result of pressures upon these plants. But even if it was laid down annually, how would there be enough matter, right? And even if it was laid down in the flood, in a cataclysmic situation, how would it be enough, considering the
amount that we use as a nation alone versus the whole world.
right? Already. Here's the other thing that's interesting. Oil reserves that seem exhausted, when left alone for a few years, replenish. So that's very interesting. So it's almost like the sand of the earth that's the most common element, silica, on the planet. But it's almost like something is continuously developing into oil somehow. And then that to me is even further shown by the fracking that they do in the Dakotas.
They're pulling that out of shale rock, aren't they?
Right. It's like, and I don't even understand that process, but it has something to do with getting the oil out of that shale rock,
Yeah.
and a lot of it.
Well, the center of our earth is hot, right?
Supposedly it is.
And so to me, as rocks and stuff, as we move things on the earth, the tides, whatever moves things, and it gets more toward the center of the earth, it would melt in my scientific mind.
Yeah, I guess what I don't know the answer to that question. I'm just bringing up questions, because that's what I was always told, that crude oil is the result of the life, plant life on the earth. I'm just questioning that. Where, how? First of all, how did that plant life get to the center of the core of the earth? The earth, even in evolutionary terms, the earth is not growing.
Right.
So it's not like more layers of material are being laid down upon the biological growth. There's just questions that I have about Darwinism that I've had even before I doubted Darwinism, because I believe Darwinism mostly all through. I mean, I never believed that we came from monkeys, because that just wasn't part of what we believed in our religion. But the rest of it was like, well, like for instance in 5th grade when they said the Colorado River carved the Grand Canyon. I remember that. And if you go to the Grand Canyon today and go on the tour, or Bryce Canyon at least, I went on the tour there, they're still saying that the river carved the canyon. And as a kid, I just remember thinking, well, that's got to be the oldest river in North America, because it's got the deepest canyon. I wonder why there weren't other rivers when the Colorado River started. Why weren't there other rivers? But it must be the oldest one because it's got the deepest canyon. And then it occurred to me that the canyon, the Colorado River, runs through a mountain, and that's because the next question I had is, well, if the Colorado River carved the Grand Canyon, then why doesn't the Grand Canyon go all the way to the sea? And so then I answered my own questions, like, oh, because it's going through a mountain range. The Grand Canyon goes through a mountain range. So then in my little mind, I was thinking, how did the water get to the top of the mountain? And so in my mind, I imagined a huge spring that came up on the top of the mountain, and it ran both directions for millions of years until it got the mountain wore down enough that then it could all go to the Pacific Ocean. But I guess that early on, half of the river went to the Gulf of Mexico until it carved it down enough. Right? I mean, I'm a kid. I'm just trying to figure it out. How did this happen, that this river carved this canyon over this mountain? Because even in 5th grade, I knew that water don't run uphill. Right? So,
Imagine being his teacher.
I was just like, that. How does that work? I'm not saying it didn't. I'm just saying, how did it do it? Well, there's no answer to that. It's like,
What would be interesting is to know what the earth looked like before the flood and after the flood, because the flood must have, with all that water coming up and receding, and there had to be a lot of eroding and mountains coming up and all kinds of things. So you
There was
wonder
an
what.
ice age in there somewhere.
after the flood.
Yes.
So the flood, the Bible says that the heavens fell down and the fountains of the deep broke forth. So there's a lot of different ideas about it. One idea is that when Genesis talks about, and God separated the land and the firmament, or the land that He called earth, and then and the waters He called the sea. That maybe there was one land mass and then the sea, and that there was a considerable amount of water under the land mass, and that when it says the fountains of the deep burst forth, is when God shifted all the continents, because you can see sort of how they would fit together, right? And it was this remarkably cataclysmic event, and if you did that, then you could imagine that there would be a tremendous amount of volcanic activity that would take place. So if the crust of the earth cracked and broke apart and fell, so that the water washed up over it, and then the water receded, if you can imagine that you, like if you push something down in the water, how it takes a little bit for it to recede, and then volcanic activity around the earth, then we find an ice age that came on after the flood suddenly. It came on suddenly. So suddenly, in fact, that in Greenland you can find woolly mammoths that are preserved, and what they had in their mouth they didn't swallow. So they were drowned quickly, landed there. The ice age came on so quickly they didn't have time to decay. That's not millions of years. That's within a few hours that the ice age came on, because there was so much volcanic ash in the air that it shadowed the earth and caused the ice age. That's one theory. I don't know if that's how it happened, but it's plausible. It's more plausible than the Colorado River coming up as a huge spring and washing both directions until it made a canyon. I'm just saying, right?
Well, they have canyons over on the other side of the mountains in Washington State, in that Toutle River Canyon, that are over 300 feet deep. And when did that happen? 1980.
Right.
That's just the force of that volcanic eruption
And the bridge that washed out.
and the Toutle River that just.
Water has a lot of force. I mean,
So
Do not
here's
get
one of
into
the
trade.
ideas. The ice age came on so fast. First of all, that the action of the flood pushed the mountains up and the valleys down. And then the ice age came on so fast that there were literally ice dams that formed. And then as the water melted, those ice dams would break, and that's what created things like, in fact, even the natural scientists say that's what created the gorge. A natural dam broke in Montana and the water came down through here.
They've got petrified trees over there now.
Right, in Spirit Lake.
Yep,
But
full
yeah,
of them. And it takes thousands of years to petrify something.
right, within 20 years.
Yeah.
Mount,
I
Within
think they
20
were
years.
petrified right after that eruption happened.
Mount St. Helens.
Yeah.
There,
Yeah.
it's, yeah,
I mean, that had to be so hot.
yeah.
So, yeah, and we know what one volcano did in terms of the ash cloud that covered,
Yeah.
and that was just one. One.
Imagine.
What would happen if you had,
The whole world doing that.
right. So, I'm just saying that empirical evidence is the same, whether you're a Darwinist or creationist. You're looking at the Grand Canyon with the Colorado River running down there. And So the Darwinist comes to the conclusion that over millions and millions of years, the Colorado River washed this big canyon in here. The fifth grader says, okay, but that water had to get over the mountain to do that. The creationist says there was a great flood according to God's word, and after the flood there was an ice age according to the evidence that we see. And when those ice dams begin to break, there were huge washouts of water that came down through, and much more likely that the sedimentary layers were laid down by that than by millions of years. So, okay, the point being this, that there is a design in the world by a certain individual who is called the father of lies, who invents things that are not true, but he's a crafty liar. And so he coats these lies in certain believabilities, calls them scientific, and then promotes those lies among a priesthood of individuals who are trusted by our culture. And in this case, that priesthood of individuals are our educators. Now, I don't have anything particularly against any individual educator. They were educated too. So they're just telling what they've been taught, but they are the purveyors of it to a large degree. And so when we believe what our priests tell us, we place our faith in their word. That's a religious thing to do. Okay. All right. So evolution, there's been no change of development in any areas of forms moving from less complicated to more complicated. Even Charles Darwin said, I will give absolutely nothing for the theory of natural selection if it requires miraculous additions at any one stage of descent. And then Julian Huxley also affirmed that to postulate a divine interference with these exchanges of matter and energy at a particular moment in Earth's history is both unnecessary and illogical. So we see that there is a theme, there's an effort to remove God from the process. In relation to the origin of man, evolution teaches that he evolved over long periods of time through the action of mutations and natural selection from simpler brute forms, which in turn had evolved from other forms, which ultimately came from an original single-celled creature. Obviously, the basis of naturalistic evolution are science and faith. Okay. Then B, we have theistic evolution. So theistic evolution holds that God directed and used and controlled the processes of naturalistic evolution to create the world and all that is in it. Usually this view includes the idea that the days of Genesis were ages, that evolutionary processes were involved in the creation of Adam, and that the earth and the pre-human forms are of great antiquity. Darwin declared that the supernatural was unnecessary in his theory. The creationists insist that naturalistic evolution is excluded in this view. Thus, theistic evolution tries to ride two horses, evolution and creation, which are going in opposite directions. Okay? The creation of Eve poses a special problem for some who teach theistic evolution. Adam, it is claimed, emerged from a pre-existing form into which God breathed the breath of life, but Eve did not come from some pre-existing form of life. She was a special act of creation. If she was, why not Adam also? So this Roman Catholic Jesuit priest and paleontologist advocated a synthesis between evolution and traditional Christian theology. Evolution stands as a central theme, though his ideas also resemble aspects of process philosophy. So strictly speaking, all that theistic evolution needs to postulate to be theistic is that there was a supernatural being who was the invisible force that started the long process of evolution. Typically, one would find this position among Roman Catholic, liberal Christian, and neo-Orthodox thinkers. But many who fall into the general category of theistic evolutionists perceive God as being involved only at the beginning of the process, not only at the beginning of the process, but at various points along the way. God stepped in to create the major stages of life throughout geological history, such as the vertebrates, the birds, the mammals, and men. But he also permitted the use of naturalistic evolutionary processes throughout the long periods of geologic time. This view is known as progressive creationism or threshold evolution, and often is linked to the day-age theory of Genesis 1. Though I would place progressive creationism under the general category of theistic evolution, some evangelicals who prefer progressive creationism would object, claiming that it really belongs under creationism. However, the kind of evolution involved in progressive creationism is naturalistic, and the extent to which it occurred was large, so the view of my judgment is misnamed, and it is a form of theistic evolution. The basis on which theistic evolution rests are the Bible and science. Okay, so let's talk about theistic evolution just a little bit more. Okay, so there's the day-age theory, which was just mentioned. These are methods used to try to reconcile creation and Darwinism.
But my 5th grade teacher, I go, God created the earth. And he goes, yes, God did, but each day's 1,000 years.
Right. Or a million.
Or a million, yeah.
So that's the day-age theory. There's each day representing an age of development. And then there is another theory called the gap theory. And that is that there were gaps in the process of creation that accounts for the millions of years. And then there's another theory called the Pre-Adamic Theory, which as well, the earth was created and was populated with dinosaurs and all these other creatures. And then when Satan was cast down out of heaven, it created destruction of the earth. And that's why the Bible says, and the earth was void and without form, and the Spirit of God brooded over the waters of the deep, and God said, let there be light. So there's something that just pre-existed the creation that we read about in Genesis, and so that's called the Pre-Adamic Theory. That explains the millions of years and the dinosaurs. Okay, and then there's day-age theory, gap theory, the Pre-Adamic Theory, and mixtures of those. Now let's just, no matter what you do when you try to reconcile Darwinism and creationism, it won't reconcile. It won't. I like how he said this. It makes sense to me. Riding two horses going in opposite directions. It's an impossibility. I finally came to this conclusion after college, because I really struggled in college trying to reconcile Darwinism and creationism. I finally came to this conclusion. Well, Darwinism's a lie, and you're not going to be able to reconcile a lie to the truth. They don't match up. So stop trying to reconcile it and reject it, and realize that if God is the creator, then he created it the way that he said he did. He doesn't need any other method. So instead of believing the Bible is truth, let's just believe the Bible is true. And if God said he did it in 6 days, that's how he did it. And if it's done by miraculous power, then we don't have to have anything else. So if Darwinism can say, hey, evolution stands on its own, it doesn't need any intervention by God, I would say the opposite. Creation stands upon God and doesn't need intervention of evolution.
Now, my uncle was a minister, an AG minister, and he taught us kids the pre-Adamic. But it just didn't click with me. So I just thought, okay, I don't know. But he was a tremendous Bible student, and he still didn't get it.
Well, here's the problem. This is the problem. We have become so convinced that the earth is millions of years old and that the Darwinistic point of view is a scientific point of view that as Christian leaders we want to be like, well, listen, you can believe creation and you don't have to reject Darwinism. You just have to adjust Darwinism so that it will fit with creation. And that way you don't have to feel like that you're being non-scientific, because we don't want to be stupids.
Well, he wouldn't have considered it Darwinism, the pre-Adamic age. He wouldn't have considered that Darwinism at all. But I think it was lack of education too.
And an effort to try to say, well, if you know they do these tests that say that rocks are millions of years old, then we got to believe, I mean, if the half-life of carbon dating system, the half-life of carbon is such that we can tell by how much carbon is left in these rocks that these rocks have to be millions of years old because we know what the decay rate of the carbon is. I'm like, wait a minute. First of all, if the half-life of the carbon is so slow that the remaining amount indicates that the missing amount is millions of years, then I don't think we observed that. I don't know how you could observe that in even a 100-year period of time and get a perspective that you could really calibrate. And then secondly, there's a huge assumption as to how much carbon was in the rocks to begin with. Especially when they carbon date the rocks that blew up out of Mount St. Helens and they get those millions of years, and it's like, you know what? No, we know when that happened. They were formed in the 80s.
From what I understand, the more scientific stuff they discover, the more it proves creation. Yeah. The more they're discovering, the more it proves evolution is totally wrong.
It does, but it's amazing how strong a hold evolution has, even in our church. Even in our church, and then the church even more so at large. In fact, I convinced several pastors in our town that evolution was not necessary, that the reconciliation to evolution was not necessary a few years ago when we had a discussion at the Ministerial Association. And I was just like, guys, understand that Darwinism is religion, not science. And then you don't have to try to reconcile it to creation, because that if you understand that Darwinism is a religion and not science, then you don't have to say that Christianity is non-scientific, which I've never thought of Christianity as being non-scientific. The scientific study and method is I've never seen Christians be like, well, we can't be in science class because that's against our religion. It's like, so, all right. Though there are variations with the broad category of creationism, the principal characteristics of this view is that the Bible is its sole basis. Science may contribute to our understanding, but it must never control or change our interpretation of Scripture in order to accommodate its findings. As far as man is concerned, creation teaches that God created the first man in his image from the dust of the ground and his own breath of life. No subhuman creature was involved, nor was any process of evolution. Creationists hold to different views regarding the days of creation, but to be a creationist, one must believe that the biblical record is factually historical, and that Adam was the first man. One view teaches that the biblical account of the creation of Adam and Eve relates only to what occurred in the Garden of Eden rather recently and does not tell us anything about what was happening in the rest of the earth. Therefore, while Adam was the result of special creation by God, in other parts of the earth, creatures were evolving over long periods of time. In other words, Adam was an island of creation in the midst of a sea of evolution. I would not consider this view as belonging under the general category of creationism, for Adam is not understood to be the first man. For Adam is not understood to be the first man from whom all mankind descended, in this idea of Adam being an island of creation in the midst of a sea of evolution. Again, it's just this attempt to try to be like, okay, well, we don't reject Darwinism because we don't want to seem like we don't believe in science. It's like, well, understand Darwinism. Again, I'm going to say it one more time. Darwinism is not science. Okay. So we need to consider in more detail evolution's proposal to answer the question of origins and some of the problems of that proposal. Many good books have been written on the subject to which one may refer for greater detail. Some I would recommend include the writings of Henry Morris and A.E. Wilder Smith and Philip Johnson and Michael Behe. All right. First, letter A, the principles of evolution. Evolution rests on several basic principles. Theories vary, but these are the common premises. The planets and stars resulted from a Big Bang explosion of compressed, rotating protons and neutrons. This dense, compressed mass continues to expand away from the original nucleus at fantastic speeds. An alternate to this principle is the so-called steady state theory that teaches that matter is continually being created in outer space and that this process has been going on for an infinite period of time. Isn't that just another way of expressing God in a false God manner?
The guy behind the curtain.
Well, here's what that is. That idea right here is the steady state theory that teaches that matter is continually being created in outer space and that the process has been going on for an infinite period of time. What's the theological term for that? That everything is God. Pantheism.
Yeah.
That's pantheism. Because if creation continues to go on in outer space and then all the matter that is created comes from there, then everything is God. Well, all right. Number 2, principle of evolution. Life began completely by chance when a single cell appeared from non-living matter. Number 3, having thus begun by chance, all other living organisms have developed from that first and subsequent simpler life form, which gradually increased in complexity. This development also produced man. So the process of evolution, if one were to reduce the process to a formula, it would look like this. Mutations plus natural selection plus time equals evolution. This formula expresses the mechanism of evolution. Mutations consist of the explanation. Mutations constitute the explanation for evolution. Mutations are sudden, small changes in the DNA code of the genes which are passed on to the offspring, causing them to differ from their parents in well-marked characteristics. In other words, a small change in an organism is passed on to the offspring. Eventually, another small change appears by chance, etc. If enough of these occur and are preserved, then the organism will become more complex and evolve into a different organism, etc. This is the way all existing forms of life were produced from a simple single-celled original. The importance of mutations as the explanation for how evolution occurred cannot be overemphasized. Not only is it an effective agency of evolution, but it is the only effective agency of evolution. Natural selection is the mechanism that preserves the changes caused by mutations. When a change occurs that is beneficial to the organism, the natural selection will preserve that change simply because it is beneficial. Any harmful changes would not be preserved because natural selection would breed them out of the line as useless. A beneficial mutation is one that increases the complexity of the organism. It is important to remember that natural selection is just that, natural. It is not laboratory selection or hothouse selection. It means that selection process in raw nature that allegedly eliminates harmful mutations and keeps helpful ones. By this process, the strain of organisms is gradually improved, given enough time. Time and long periods of it are frequently necessary. Time and long periods of it are therefore necessary to evolution. Since mutations do not occur frequently, there will have to be a lot of time in order for enough of the beneficial mutations to occur, then to be preserved by natural selection, thereby effectively changing the organisms to increasingly complex ones. In order to decrease the time required, some evolutionaries posit bursts of mutations have occurred at about the same time, which affected a number of beneficial changes in an organism almost immediately, thus shortening the time required for the necessary changes to take place.
Where did time come from? From a one cell molecule that all of a sudden you've got time, space, and matter all of a sudden, out of nothing.
All of a sudden you've got all these planets orbiting the sun at perfect precision.
Yeah.
Well, this is.
And they
this
keep
is
using that
Nazism.
word time.
This is what?
Nazism, isn't it?
No, it's evolutionism.
But isn't that what the Nazis thought, that they could create this superhuman being?
Well, yes, but that's different. Now, Nazism was based in Darwinism, but what they believed is actually true, that if you breed towards a given result, you can find that result. But you don't find a new species, it's still people. If you breed towards blonde folks, you could eliminate all the folks with dark hair, but you would still have
Get a
people.
redhead.
Yeah? And then think how mean the world would be.
That was a carrot top.
So,
Resembled that a lot when I was a baby.
okay. So when you read this explanation of evolution, and it's like, well, yeah, that's what it is. It's like, well, a couple of questions come to mind in the young fifth grader.
I like it.
Here's one question. Okay, if natural selection retains the good mutations and the bad mutations die out until a new species occurs, then why would any preceding form remain?
Why are there birds and fish, in other words?
Yes.
Why do we have disease?
Or I saw this program about these catfish that have lungs, and it said, they developed these lungs so that they could survive, because where they live, it floods and then the floods recede, and then they have to use their lungs to breathe air while they go from the dry pond to a pond that has water. And so it shows them, they're kind of walking across the dry ground and they're breathing, and then they go into the next pond, which is full of fish that don't have lungs. And so the premise is that these fish have lungs or they couldn't survive. And that's why they develop lungs. And yet we see in the picture fish that have no lungs all around them. And it's like, that can't possibly be the why behind why that they have lungs. It can't be because if they didn't, they would cease to survive, and so therefore they develop lungs. Because the fish without lungs are still swimming. Okay? So when I see this process being perpetuated, I'm like, why would that be? How could it be? How could any of the if you had to develop such and such in order to be naturally selected to survive, and anything else would go by the wayside, then there shouldn't be anything else. Just the fish with lungs. That's the only one. How about this? God is a God of incredible variety and infinite creativity. And he saw fit to create some fish that had lungs.
Yeah.
There you go.
It's too easy.
And he had a sense of humor. I mean, he has giraffes and he has all these strange looking animals.
That's right. He made the platypus.
Yeah.
Okay.
He made
Well,
possum.
mutations, isn't that where cancer comes from?
Yes. And so, what time is it?
5 till 8.
5 till.
Okay, we have just enough time to read the problems of evolution, starting with A, the problems of mutations. Can mutations really do all they are alleged to do? Consider the following. Mutations are rare and almost always harmful. In the fruit fly experiment where mutations were produced by artificial means, it is estimated that only one fruit fly out of 1 million will develop a mutation. Furthermore, the guy that conducted these many fruit fly experiments acknowledged that most mutants are more or less disadvantageous, and that the deleterious nature of most mutations seems to be a very serious difficulty. All right, number 2, where do new genes come from? No mutation has ever produced a new species or even a new organ or system in an existing species. Yet this had to occur if evolution is valid. Protozoa, for instance, do not have teeth. Where then did the genes come from that produced teeth if we have evolved from protozoa? Mutations concern changes in existing organisms. They do not produce new ones. Yet somewhere and somehow along the line of new species had to be produced. And even new systems like the circulatory system or the hearing system had to be produced within existing systems. Here is an example of how evolution wrestles with this question. If mutations, which is the only form of hereditary change of which we have definite evidence, is always change in genes already present, it would at first sight seem that we have here no basis at all for understanding the evolution of novelties in the organization of the body. For their evolution, we surely need new hereditary factors, not change in those already present. But we must remember that conditions in the body and the hereditary material are extremely complex. Possibly changes in the distribution of enzymes in the body, if they were somehow brought about, might cause new difference in rates of growth or parts, as for instance in a part of the frontal bones of the skull, resulting in the early evolution of horns. It is hard to see how redistribution of enzymes would be brought about by mutation of a gene, but in view of the complexity of the conditions of the body, it may perhaps be possible. Also, it is not impossible that new genes may have evolved. We know that genes may be reduplicated within the chromosomes, and when that has happened, one member of such a pair might become so altered by mutation as to give us what is functionally a new gene. these suggestions are purely hypothetical. For the present, we cannot say more than the novelties of organization undoubtedly occur in evolution. They are essential to the increase in complexity which is associated with the progress in evolution, that we have no accurate knowledge of the details of their evolution. So, this appears to be more an exercise in faith than in fact. And that is how I started this lecture, is that Darwinism is a religious system. And once we realize that, we can be greatly relieved that we don't have to make it scientific. Oh, we will continue next week. This is the good stuff. We're getting down to the nitty-gritty.
Definitely not confused.
All right. We are suffering from Darwinism in an incredible way in our culture and in society around the world, because Darwinism effectively erased the line in people's minds between humanity and the rest of the animals. And that did irreparable damage. And so,
That's why you can kill 3-day-old babies.
yeah,
Oh, no.
yeah, that's exactly
Not
right.
A kitty,
But not a kitty.
no.
Don't kill a kitty.
I won't tell
Back
everything I
in
know.
Maryland, they tried to get it to 28 days to kill a child.
Where?
In Maryland, they tried to this year, but they didn't
28 days.
get there, but they were doing 28 days
So,
After birth.
after birth.
what was the result of the 3-day legislation? Did it fail?
I didn't hear whether
I think it stands.
in California.
I think they're fighting it in court.
It's
But in
just,
Maryland, it did pass that you can have a nurse practitioner or a doctor's assistant do abortions. So it doesn't even have to be a doctor now. Just anybody pretty much can do an abortion now.
Oh, nuts.
Which
well,
doesn't seem
we
to
better,
us to
you know, we better be careful or people will start doing abortions by shooting the mother. That's a bizarre statement, right? But if you say, well, we can do the abortion 3 days after the baby's born, or 28 days after it's born, how about 28 years after it's born? How about we need to abort the baby, and the quickest way to do it is shoot the mom in the head? You're like, that's a ludicrous thing to say, is it? We never thought it would be possible to start even talking about abortions 3 days or 28 days after the baby was born. By definition, that's not an abortion,
murder.
It's homicide.
right? So I'm just saying that this is a long, slippery slope, and people think that we're going to skate on that safely. But you're right. Darwinism created an ethic whereby it could seem reasonable and good. Well, after all, what quality of life would that poor child have? And how would that impact that child have on the rest of us be positive? It's the best thing to do.
The compassionate thing.
Yeah. Yeah, so. Whew.
Or, Brett, taking it one step further, telling the second grader that you're just you're here by chance, you know, so you really don't amount to anything, and then they can't figure out why they're self-harming and
Let them believe they're not a boy.
Yes.